All right, you guys absolutely crushed it in the last video. I'm confident of that. This is the real deal. We have authenticated users, we've created user profiles, we've written and read from a remote server that we are updating in real time. This is the real deal. This is how you build real applications. But one thing that you may have noticed in the last video is that some of the code we wrote was not fully reusable, and we did a lot of hard coding of strings, manually making dictionaries. And so while that works, I would say that's more of a beginner level approach. And what we're gonna do now is the more swifty, elegant way to basically write that code. And we're gonna do that primarily using the Codable protocol, which we've also done several times on my channel. So if you don't know what Codable is, first pause this and then go to the continued learning playlist on my channel and check out the Codable video. We go into detail on exactly what it is, how it works. You need to know how it works in order to fully understand what we're doing in this video. Of course, you can follow along and you don't have to know, I guess, but that's my recommendation. It will really clear things up for this video. So here again, we're not focused on new Firebase features that we don't know yet, but we're focused on how can we write our Swift code to be super reusable and efficient so that when we start moving towards more complex things in the next bunch of videos, we have things set up in our code base already so that we don't have to repeat ourselves, right? One of those keywords everyone likes to repeat is dry, D-R-Y, don't repeat yourself. The way to not repeat yourself when you're writing code like this is to figure out ways to make your code more efficient and reusable, exactly what we're going to jump into right now.
All right, welcome back, guys. We are back. We are here. We are coding. We're setting up a database. This is real stuff, man. This is creating real apps on a server with a backend. So if you're just following my course and you're just up to this point, I mean, this is the real deal. This is how we fetch, load, create user profiles. This is the real stuff. I'm super excited to be going through this with you guys. I absolutely love Firebase. In the last video, we set up the user profile. We wrote to the database, created their profile in the database, and then we fetched it back. We're going to build off that in this video. So if you were not with me and you're just joining now, you're probably going to be lost. Watch the last video before this one, or probably better to watch the whole course if you got the time, because everything is building on top of each other. So in the last video, we created this function to get user and this other function to create the user. And this works, obviously, because it's working in our database, but this is a lot of code and it's not very scalable, right? We should probably find a more scalable way to be doing this. And the way to do that is using Codable. In Swift, we can decode objects using Decodable. We can also encode objects using Encodable, both are which under the hood of Codable. So if you don't know what Codable is, I have a video in the Swiftful Thinking Continued Learning playlist where I covered Codable in detail. Highly recommend watching that before this. All right, let's write some better code. Firstly, let's just look at this. So this line looks very similar to this line, right? Both are accessing this same document and the same collection. So maybe we can make these goals or functions in the file so we don't have to write this out every single time. Up here, I'm going to say private let, and let's call this the user collection, right? Just like it is in our database, the user collection of users, and we'll set it equal to the firestore.firestore.collection.users. Great. And then let's create another private func, and let's just call this, maybe a user document, right? Because every user is going to have a document inside that collection. And we need the user ID for the document. So let's pass in a user ID of type string, and let's return that document location. So let's just make it a string for a second. And we're going to return the user collection document at that user ID, right? So the same thing we have here, the collection document. We're just going to call it collection.document. And we're returning it back out of this function. So type document reference is what it looks like. And let's put that here. So now let's make this line of code down here, try await user document. with the user auth.uid, and we'll put in our setData on that. Just to clean that up a little bit, I think that looks better. And the same thing down here. So this user document, I'm just going to copy it and paste it right here. And now it's just a little bit easier. Anyone who wants to create a function can just access the user document, and we'll pass in our user ID. All right, one step down, one more step to go. Now here we're creating a dictionary and then pushing the dictionary. Here we are taking that dictionary, trying to strip it out and then convert it into a user. Really what I want to do is just push and pull a user, this database user. So we already have this database user up here, and let's just conform to Codable. Okay, conforming to Codable is to both encodable and decodable. So now we can get data and convert it to the database user, and we can take the database user and convert it to some sort of data or dictionary that we can then push. Now, in a second, we're going to create custom encoders and decoders, but for right now, let's just leave this as is, and let's try to write another function. And so what I'm going to do here is create another func called create new user. Same thing as this one, except here I'm going to pass in a user, which is a type database user. Async throws, open the brackets. And just like we did down here, I'm going to call this to set data, except this time we're going to set data, and we're going to look for the one with the value of type, this first one, I think. So it says from of type T. And if I open this up, see if we go to the documentation here, we can see, again, if you're just following along, you don't really know what generics are. I'd cover that in my advanced course. This is a generic. So a generic type, any type that conforms to encodable is what T must be. And so if we look here, Codable does conform to encodable and decodable. So we can now pass this user in as that type. We don't need a custom encoder. Let's pass in our user here. And I think it's going to tell us that we got to remove this await. Sorry, the user ID is going to be the user.user ID. And yes, there's no async operations, so we can actually just delete this. We can even make this synchronous because there's no async operations in here. I feel like this should be an asynchronous call because it really should push to the database. I don't know if maybe they're going to change I feel like they might change this in the future to support maybe Swift concurrency. So I'm just going to leave this as asynchronous for now. All right. We also, when we do this, the merge, let's add in the merge. So the merge of false. So we have the same line of code here and here, except this time, instead of creating a whole dictionary, we're just going to push the user itself. All right. I'm going to go back to my authentication view model. And let's go to our sign in anonymous. And so instead of sending in the auth data result to this function, we're going to switch it up. So let's comment this out. Let's say try await user manager shared dot create new user with a user. So first let's create a user. We'll say let user equals database user, open the parentheses, and then we can fill this in. So auth data result dot UID, auth data result dot is anonymous, auth data result dot email, and auth data result dot photo URL. And then date created will just be right now. So we'll just add in a date. And I'll take the user and pass that in here, and then it should push to Firebase. All right. So again, let's build and run this. And we're using the sign in anonymous. So every time I do this, it's going to create a new user and then create a new user profile. That's what I am going for purposely. Later, we're going to start signing into the same account every time. All right. So here is my old profile. I'm going to sign out, log out, and then let's sign in anonymously. And this new user, it looks like the user profile did not load. Okay. So the user profile did not load, and let's look into that right now, actually. So we created this new user and we took their database, we made a user and we pushed that to the database, right? And so we're pushing this. Now, when we did this call here, we didn't tell it all of the exact keys that we wanted it to have, right? We just said push this user. So Swift is just going to push it as it is right here in this codable struct. So if I look at my database right now, if I open up the database and I see this is our new user here, we can see that the fields, the keys are actually, we can see that the keys are actually camel case, right? And the first one we made, the keys were lowercase snake case. So that's why our get function, our get user function is now failing because it can't find anything at this key or this key because the keys have changed. So this is something you have to be very aware of when we are using these codable types. It's going to use the keys that are in the codable, that are baked into the codable protocol unless you override them. All right, so let's go back to our app now. And we're going to run through the same process again, but this time we're going to add in an encoder. So let's add in an encoder. So an encoder, we can give a custom rule on how you want to encode the data. All right, so let's create a custom encoder for this function. So in here, we can also add in an encoder, and it needs to be of type Firestore.encoder. So let's create up here a private let, and let's make this encoder of type Firestore.encoder. And we'll set it equal to a function. I'm making it a function because we're going to take a couple steps to actually create this. So first we'll say let encoder equals Firestore.encoder. And then we'll say encoder dot, looking for the key encoding strategy. This is, so here's our dictionary. These are the keys. These are the values. The keys are in snake case, right? And so we want to set this equal to convert to snake case, and it will return the encoder from this. Pass this in here. And let's run our app one more time. So let's log back out of this account and let's try this again. Sign in anonymously. This time we're going to use the custom encoder. Sign in anonymously. All right. And it worked. All right. And it looks like it worked because we got our data here. Let's check it out in the database. Let's open it up. And so our new users is FL. And we can see in the last one, we had this camel case, and now FL is back to snake case. Perfect. So if our app converted perfectly to camel case or to snake case, we can use these decoders. Let's fetch this value now. So let's come back to our code. We no longer need this function because this one is just so much cleaner than doing this every time, right? Comment this out. Get user, we want to do the same thing basically. Let's create another func called get user. Let's actually just give it the same syntax here. And this time we are going to, instead of just get document, we'll say get document as, and we'll pass in what type of document do we want to get. Of course, we want to get a database user.self is the type that we want to get back. So convert it, decode it from the document to the database user. So this, if we get this, it should be of type database user, and we can just return that back. So here, I'm just going to delete this and return it back, right? So already this function, so much shorter than this one, right? I'm going to comment this one out because we don't need it anymore. And we're just going to do this. Now I'm going to run it. I think this will fail. Where are we? What is the problem? Oh, we commented this other function out. All right. So instead of using this create new user, let's, oh, you know what? We should do this before. So, all right. So the database user. So let's actually copy this and paste it here. Let's paste it here. So now we're using this database user, and then let's run the app again. You gotta do one more place. Let's do it here. All right. Let's run the app one more time. This time we're going to try to get the document as a database user, rather than actually going through the dictionary ourselves. But we're going to see, I think, that it will fail. And again, it's failing because we need to give it that custom snake case and convert it back. It's defaulting to camel case. So just like we did with an encoder here, we're just going to make a decoder. And we'll Firestore.decoder. And the decoder, and we'll return that decoder. Let's come down here. Let's add in our decoder. Let's run our app one more time. Where are we? What did I do wrong? Firestore.decoder, decoder.key decoding strategy. That's why I shouldn't have copied and pasted. All right, run this one more time and hopefully it works. And we got so much more to do. Oh my God, I am excited and also a little bit worried that maybe this is taking too long longer than what you guys had expected. But honestly, like getting this all down pat, I think sets you up for the long run of like managing your database smoothly forever, right? Like if you're confused at this point, it's only going to get worse when you have a million users. So anyway, we got our profile here and it worked now because we have our decoder in. A second ago, we updated all of these functions to create a user from these auth data results. And I don't like all of this bulky code. So let's actually go to the database user and let's create a custom init from the auth user. So we'll just pass in the auth of type auth data result model. And self.userid equals auth.uid, self.isanonymous equals auth.isanonymous, self.email equals auth.email, self.photo URL equals auth.photo URL, self.date created equals auth.date created. Or actually, there is no date created in the auth, which is basically why we're creating this other object, right? Because there's going to be a ton of values that are not in the auth that we're going to have in our user. So if we are initializing a user from an auth model, let's just make the date created the current date, right? So same thing we were doing on the other screen, but now we're just doing a convenience initializer here. So here we're just going to create a user from the auth data results. And this looks super clean code, right? I think you guys would agree. Let's go to that email view model, do it here as well. Awesome. We're going to wrap one more time just to make sure that works. Awesome. I'm saying it before I even see it. All right, it works. Great. All right, let's add a button to the screen for whether or not the user is premium. We're going to go into the profile and let's just say, so whether or not the user is premium will be a value inside the database user. So we'll jump into the database user. Let's say let is premium of type bool, and we'll make it optional. When we in this initializer, we'll say self.isPremium and we'll set it equal to false. Let's go back to our code here. And on our screen, we're just going to create a very simple button for now with an action and a label. All right, so let's say user.isPremium. And if there's no value, let's just give it a default value of false. And I want to make this a string, so I'm going to wrap this in parentheses and then just use the .description and let's call capitalized. And when we click this button, we want to toggle their premium status in our database. So firstly, let's run this, make sure it's on the screen. Cool. And now when I click this, we want to toggle whether or not they are premium in our database. So we need a function for that. And let's go to our user manager and let's write another function here, put it below the get user stuff. Let's say func update user premium status, right? And so we are going to have to try await. Let's access that user document that we created before. And again, we're going to need to pass in a user ID. So we'll pass that in here. And then the question is, how are we going to update this document, right? So we already have the document in our database. Now we just want to update it. So we can do the same thing that we did up here. So we can say, we did a get document, we did set data. We can set data again. And we can say merge true. So merge this data with the existing data and use this encoder. And so actually here for this function, we would actually pass in a updated user of type database user, which will be async throws. And this will be the user.userid. And again, it's giving us that this is not actually asynchronous. So let's just delete that real quick. Let's call this from our code. I'm going to go back to the profile view. Let's create a function in our view model called func toggle premium status. Let's call it from our button. So view model dot toggle premium status. And what we're going to do is first call that function. So we're going to say user manager shared dot update user premium status. And so we're going to need to pass in an updated user. So we have the current user here. So first, let's say guard let user else return. So if we have this user, which obviously we will because it's loading. So if we have this user, we then want to change the value of the isPremium inside this user. All right, so now we need to update this user. This is a struct. There's a bunch of ways you can update a struct. You can mutate the struct. If you don't know what mutating a struct is, I have an entire massive video on my playlist, on my channel in the Swift concurrency playlist called struct versus class versus actor, value versus reference type, stack versus heap. This is probably the most important video on my entire channel if you're a Swift developer. An hour and a half long, and it's very, I would say, difficult, but there's a lot to unpack there. Most of your iOS interview questions are answered inside this video. So I highly recommend watching that if you don't know what mutating a struct is. But what we're going to do right now is actually just create another user object from this one. So let's say let updated user and set it equal to a database user. And we want to initialize one manually here, but we can't. We only have initializer from this auth result. So earlier we passed in a UID and all that good stuff, but when we created that auth initializer, it got rid of our initial initializer. So we actually can add another one here to manually update this data model. So I could pass in all of these types. I'm just going to copy this. Let's see if I type in here, will this autofill? This won't autofill for me. All right, so I'm just going to delete this, paste these in. Let's get rid of the let's. All right, let's add a comma here. And let's give some default values. So this will equal to nil if we don't want to pass one in. And we'll just do that for all of these. All right, let's highlight Control I, and then self.userid equals user ID. Self.isAnonymous equals isAnonymous. Email, photo URL, date created, and isPremium. All right, we don't need a comma here. Now we can go back to our database user, create a new one from all of this data. So we'll pass in this user dot user ID dot is anonymous dot email dot photo URL date created is premium. Now the is premium, we want to do the opposite of the current value. So the current value equals user dot is premium, otherwise false. And then here we're going to pass in the opposite of the current value. And then we'll pass in our updated user. We will try await. And if this is successful, let's then refetch the user from the back end so that we get an updated user on our screen. We could just set self.currentUser equal to this user, but I want to be extra safe and actually refetch it from the back end here. So let's do this. The user ID will be the user.user ID. And this is an asynchronous function. All right, so let's just make a task here. Cool, I'm gonna run this. Let's see if it works. And this is the first time we are updating data in Firebase in an existing document. So we're in this document here, I think, let's see. And FLQ, yep. All right, so now let's click this, and now it's true. We can set it back to false, and it's working. Just like that, we now have our user working perfectly. Before we move forward, I'm going to talk about a bunch of different ways we could have written this code because I feel like it's important to touch on. All right, so a couple things that we need to note here. So obviously this is working. We took this user and then we created a new user with all of these values. All the values are the same except for the one that we are changing. And this was a very viable way to do it. But there is better ways to write this, of course. This is kind of your beginner level version. So let's just do this inside the user itself. So we can just do this inside the user itself. So go into the database user here, and let's actually just create a function inside this user. And let's say toggle premium status. And this will be a function that returns us a database user. So just like we did here, I'm going to copy this and then paste it here, except this is just going to return the database user. So I'm going to put these on separate lines, just like our initializer. And instead of the values here of a user, we're just going to pass in the current values that are in the object. So this user ID inside the object. So I don't even need to put in user here. I can delete it here, here, and here. And the current value is going to be the opposite. And then here, let's just put let current value equals isPremium, otherwise full. And voila. Now we have a function that will do this for us. So in our code now, we can just call let updated user equals user dot toggle premium status. And I'll delete these 2 lines of code. This already looks way better to me. We can even one line it, right? We can just put it right here and that would be super quick. But let's just keep it like this for now. Let's run, make sure it still works. Looks like it's working. Let's check this. Sweet. What other ways can we update a struct? So what this function is doing is it's taking the current struct and then creating and returning a new struct. This is how I did it in the to-do list playlist, I think, on my channel. We took the value and returned a new struct with updated values. And this works, it definitely does work. But we could make it a little bit more efficient. Now we're getting to become better developers. We could actually take the current struct and just mutate it and just change a value inside the existing struct. And so the way to do that is we need to make our struct no longer immutable. So structs, unlike classes, in a class, you have an instance and you can change a value inside that instance. In a struct, you have to mutate the struct, which is basically regenerating the struct. So we need to mutate it. And again, if you don't know what this means, check out that other video on my YouTube channel. So the value we're going to change is premium. So let's just make it a var. All right. So now instead of calling this function, let's just make a struct and then toggle is premium. We can go back to profile view. So here we have a user, and then we're going to call user dot is premium and set it equal to the opposite of the current value. So again, let's say let current value equals user dot is premium, otherwise false. Set it equal to the opposite. And then we're going to take the user and pass it in here. We're going to get an error because user is a constant. And now that we are changing this object of user, we're going to make it a variable. All right, let's run it one more time. Make sure it still works. I know I'm doing like a little bit of getting sidetracked here, but this is important stuff because all of our data models are going to work like this. Here we go. It's still working. But to me, this code, I don't like that we now have exposed this toggling to other files in our app. So what we can actually do is come in here and kind of make a middle ground between these two. We can create another function that is toggle premium status. And here we can just set the is premium values, the local value, which is up here. We'll just set it equal to not current value. And instead of returning us a separate database user, let's just mutate the current one. And we're going to get a warning here that this function needs to be marked as mutating. So here we'll add mutating, meaning we're going to mutate the struct from within the struct itself. So now I can come up here and I can just say user.toggle premium status. and run it one more time. It looks like we should have changed. Actually, let's comment out this version because we're not using it anymore. Run it one more time. The function, the syntax in this and this are exactly the same. And that's why we got that ambiguous use, because it's ambiguous of which one we wanted to call. But now we have this nice clean code here, and then we'll pass in our user. And hopefully it still works. Sweet. All right, now let's move on from this struct nonsense to actually the function in our Firestore document here. We are taking this user and pushing basically this whole user object back to the database. So every time that we do this right, all of the fields in the database user are getting pushed to our database. So it looks like only the isPremium is changing because all of the other values are the same, and Firebase knows that and is smart like that. But if we had any other value that was also different, even though this function is just update premium status, all of the data from here is getting pushed to the server. And this is incredibly important because you could imagine a situation in your app where the data in this user is maybe stale, right? Maybe something else happened between the time when you downloaded this database user and when you're writing to the user profile, right? And so when you push this, it might be pushing stale data, and it's actually going to overwrite whatever data is in the database. So when we use this setData, we do have to be extremely careful about, is this good data or not? Because we're going to touch all of the keys that are in this user. We're not only going to touch one single key. So personally, I think this is dangerous, and I don't really like this in my app. A second reason to change off of this is that what if you're in a place in your app where you didn't have access to the entire user profile, right? In this case, you would have to then go download the whole user profile and then push the new version. But I might be somewhere where I just have that new premium status, true or false, and that's all I want to write to the database. So there's actually another function we can write, and I'll do it here. And we're just going to pass in isPremium of type bool. And this time, instead of setData, we're going to call .updateData. And we can see that this takes a dictionary, not a whole object. And this one is asynchronous, so we put our async await word back in here. And then we can update a specific field only. So instead of setting an entire object and a whole document, we're just going to update the existing document at whatever field we include. So let's create just like we had up here where we created a dictionary. Let's just create a dictionary here of type, let's call this data. And what fields do we want to touch? Well, we just want to touch isPremium, and we want to set it to the isPremium value that we're passing in here, right? And then we're going to take our data and let's just pass it into the function. We also now need to pass in a user ID of type string so that we know what document to write to. So we'll pass that in here. All right. Now, this code might look like it's written a little bit more code, but it's significantly safer than doing this method. So now let's call this from our code. And so we're going to go back to our profile view. So instead of this whole toggle premium status, we're just going to say let current value equals user.isPremium, otherwise false. And we can change this back to a let because we're not going to mutate it anymore. So this current value, now we're just going to update premium status with the user ID and isPremium. User ID will be user.userID and isPremium will be not current value. So run our code one more time. Let's make sure that it's still working. Also, this is really good stuff, guys. I know we're literally changing one piece of data, but we're writing a lot of good code here. Let's keep going. So update user premium status, make this a let. All right, now I want to talk through another edge case because it's very important and I feel like people run into this and get stumped a lot of times. So basically, this time, let's do the same function here, except let's change the key so that it is not exactly our snake case. So let's change this to maybe let's change this to maybe user underscore is premium. This is a terrible naming convention. You should not do it in your app. But you could imagine, let's just say maybe there's a web team, Android team, someone on one of those teams writes it this way, right? And so let's write this to our database now, right? Now we wrote it once to the database, but every time we fetch that user again, we're not getting back that updated value, because when we fetch the user, we're referencing this and not this, right? Because our snake case references this. So even if we delete this, let's delete this actually, and then toggle this, we can see that it's now false. Even though the user is premium is true, we're still looking for data at that other key. Question then becomes, well, what on earth do we need to do if these values are not actually lining up perfectly with our decoding and encoding strategy? Well, that's what we're going to do now. So basically, this convert to snake case is super convenient if everything follows snake case, right? And if it was camel case, we didn't have to do this at all because that's the default. But if it doesn't follow any of these perfectly to a T, we need to create a custom encoder or decoder for that object. So we're going to go back to our object now. This is our database user. And so let's try to clean this up a little bit. Toggle premium status, we are no longer using. I'm just going to comment it out. I'm going to change this back to a let because we're not mutating anymore. And so we already conformed to Codable. So we have the default encoder, but let's customize it now. So I'm going to come down here and let's type in encoder. And if you're using Xcode 14, it's going to autofill this in for you, which is amazing. We used to have to type this ourselves. And decoder. All right. And so let's put the decoder actually above this, and let's put the coding keys on top. All right. And so what this is telling us is when we decode from an object, so we're downloading from Firebase, we are going to decode it into string. If present is like optional bool, optional string. And the key that it's going to use when it gets this is anonymous is the isAnonymous coding key, which is here. These are coding keys, and this one is anonymous. And so these coding keys are going to be based on that decoding strategy. So if we don't have it, so the basic decoding strategy is going to make this is anonymous, right? It's the same thing. If we have that snake case, it's going to be is_anonymous. But now we have a situation in our app where this is premium doesn't follow either of those. And so what we want to actually do is give it a custom coding key. So I'm going to come to the key that it is and paste that in here. And enum can have a raw value if it doesn't have a raw type. So these coding keys have a raw type of string. And I think that error goes away now. So now when we decode and encode is premium, it's referencing this is premium coding key, which is right here. And it's going to use this value instead of the default. All right. And so now we just want to tell these functions to use these coding keys rather than that whole other snake case that we set up. So all of these I'm going to actually convert into what they are in our database exactly. So here I'm going to do user_ID is anonymous, email, photo, URL, date created. All right. Now I know this is a little extra work and it's adding bulk to our code, but this allows us to be absolutely dynamic going forward, right? Because we don't have to follow a specific rule. If there's ever like a bug in our app, we can fix it in 2 seconds. So once you get this down, very easy to work with going forward. You just need to understand how it works. So now since we're using these custom coding keys, we no longer want to use the encoder and the decoder here. So I'm going to comment these out and we're just going to use the default values, which will use that custom, that And so when we don't give it a custom encoder or decoder, it's going to use whatever the encoding strategy is inside that object. So let's run this one more time. And if I look at this user isPremium is true. So if we get that value in our app, we know we did something correct. Looks like I have a bug here. Delete the encoder. I'm going to comment this function out actually, because we're not using it anymore. We're going to use this one. Yeah. Awesome. All right. Hopefully this is true. And we are back to our app working. Awesome. Look at that. Now we don't even need to follow any specific rule. We can create any kind of keys we want. Now, obviously, if you're creating the app yourself, probably should follow a specific rule. It's a good rule to have, right? But for me, this is more like I started an app. Maybe some other developer came in, set up the back end, set up a web app, accidentally wrote the wrong thing. And if they accidentally do that and you don't have all this set up, it's going to take you a while to create your encoder, create your decoder, set up all of your other objects. I'd rather do it just from the start. That's just my personal preference. Cool. Last thing I'm going to note here is that I don't like that we are raw stringing it here, right? We are typing in the key manually. So obviously we could set the data from the whole object, but again, that's a little dangerous. And so really what we want to do is make sure we're using the exact coding key from the user object. And so we can actually, now that we set this up, we can actually access the object and then access the coding key and then access the isPremium and then access the raw value. So I'm just going to come down here and let's use the database user coding keys isPremium.raw value. So now there's no guessing game, right? We're literally using the exact coding key to upload that we are to encode and decode. So let's check it one final time, make sure that this works. And just like that, we are now writing amazing code, I think at least. All right, that's it for this video. We didn't do too much, but we also did a ton. We really focused on how to encode and decode our data objects and then update them and send updated values to the database. In the next video, we're going to start looking at some of the more custom data types. So not just Booleans, but arrays and timestamps and things like that. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. As always, I'm Nick. This is Swiftful Thinking, and I'll see you in the next video.